Hi everyone. So this is my provisional question still, I'm afraid. So what can museums learn from the commercial media sector? Now, in terms of what I'll be addressing is I'll give you a bit of context in terms of public funding, corporate involvement in the UK, a brief definition of sponsorship and patronage, how big the sponsorship market is, also some reasons as to why I've decided to investigate this topic, a bit of a theoretical context to my topic, and then finally also a brief introduction about a case study that I'm thinking about approaching. Most of us know this, but essentially public funding has been decreasing since the 1980s, which is just when the Margaret Thatcher's government came to power, and essentially they were favouring a free market economy. And then after that we've seen the big financial crash, and then since then things have been steadily getting worse in this space. Now in this table here you can see basically what the corporate funding looks like in the UK, and particularly looking at London, arguably one of the biggest markets in the UK. Corporate funding only accounts for 22%, which is absolutely tiny. And then of course, you know, if you look at the smaller regions, that level goes even further down. Now, in terms of public and corporate funding in the UK, you can see that the total private investment is 480 million, but only 96 million of that comes from businesses, and that's a figure from 2014 to 2015, and only a tiny 7% of that of 96 million goes to museums. So that's about less than 7 million in essence. Again, tiny numbers. A few definitions now. Sponsorship, and this is a definition that is being advocated by the Thatcher's government, saying that it's a commercial undertaking, so a payment by a business to an organization, an art organization, for the purpose of promoting the business name, products or services. And then patronage is essentially a donation or a gift. Now this distinction is there because for tax purposes. And it's quite interesting because I found that in a lot of academic sources that I've been looking at, these two terms are very often used interchangeably, but also in a work environment, which can cause some issues, because obviously what tends to happen is that sometimes a company approaches a museum or a cultural institution and they say, oh, we're donating a gift, and then later on they come in with a long list of benefits that they expect the cultural institutions to fulfill. So obviously you can see that there are quite a few implications going on there. And then briefly, the size of the sponsorship market. So if you look at the cultural sector, on average, that is generating approximately £150 million in a year, which is approximately the revenue generated by one medium-sized business. By comparison, if you look at the revenue that is generated by the TV advertising industry, so 3.87 billion, you can clearly see that the potential for corporate involvement is absolutely huge. So in terms of the reasons for investigating this topic, and also my focus. So my focus is looking at art sponsorship, and particularly museums. I also want to explore if business tactics and practices utilized in the commercial media sector can be adapted to the cultural sector. But I want to focus on TV and maybe some digital elements as well. And the ultimate goal really would be to guarantee sustainability in the sector. But I also see this as a personal challenge because, as most of you know, I'm a media professional and I've been working in the sector for the past 16 years. I'm still very heavily involved. I work for myself, so I plan big media campaigns for a handful of advertisers. So I'm still very, very connected to that industry, but also I'm doing a lot of work with the Design Museum in their corporate development team. So really for me, I'm really trying to make a difference, even if small, to see if there is anything that I can bring to the equation to ensure sustainability in the long run. In terms of the methodology, I'll be using obviously academic sources, industry magazines, reports, articles, if I can, interviews, and case studies, although I'll tell you in a minute what I'm finding a little bit difficult. In terms of the theoretical context, I'm looking at a few theories, one of which is the appropriation of culture. So Qintao Wu is talking about the fact that very often companies are not only just fulfilling marketing objectives, but what happens is that they also appropriate culture. And these are views that are shared by a number of other theorists. So Rectanus, for example, talks about the fact that essentially corporate partnership has got a role in shaping our culture. And quite very often what happens is that they're actually using that partnership to promote sides to their businesses that are not socially responsible. I then want to look at theories of symbolic capital, which for Bourdieu mean prestige, honor, and credit that comes from knowledge. So you get that by, so an individual can acquire symbolic capital by acquiring knowledge. So my question there, so what you come to question there is essentially looking at what happens in a corporate context, whereby you're getting a corporation coming in, sponsoring an exhibition, and even though they may not have particular knowledge in art and culture, they are acquiring that honor and that prestige that goes with that association. Similarly, we've got, we can see some views that are similarly shared by German artist Hans Hack. He talks about culture as high culture, and he includes things like poetry, dance, screenplays, but he's also talking about the fact that everything is changeable because it very much depends on who is watching the art, who is consuming the art. So really that definition of art can change over time. Which is obviously very interesting because we've seen that happening. For instance, even the value of culture is changing. Most recently, there's a lot of emphasis on what that value is in politics, and certainly the fact politicians are talking about the fact that art is having an economic and social impact. However, obviously that instrumental value is very, very difficult to quantify. And then similarly, it's really interesting that the Department of Culture, Media and Sports are defining the creative industries, of which obviously art is very much part of, in a very broad way. So including sectors that you would not normally associate with the arts and culture. So, you've got the inclusion of the internet, the national lottery, advertising, press, publishing, sport. So it's very, very broad. And then some of the themes that I will be discussing, analysing, obviously in conjunction with the television sector, are to do with looking, for example, of the fact that museums are usually born as registered charities. So actually trying to fully adapt to a commercial model can be quite challenging. The fact that the sector, the vast majority of the sector is lacking in some commercial expertise, which is quite crucial if you're trying to appeal to the corporate sector. It's about thinking about negotiation skills and thinking about using the right terminology, and also the type of information that corporations would need to make that decision. Also, there's a need to devise a new pricing structure as well. We've seen a lot of successful case studies and sponsorships in the arts sector. However, the usual sponsorship fee doesn't go above the 250k mark per year, which is very, very little. And then also the fact that the potential for our sponsorship is great. There are obviously a lot of agencies that just specialize in sponsorship, and they are actually demanding a premium to all of their clients because of the level of work involved. Another issue is networks. So the corporate networks that the cultural sector is exposed to is very, very limited. So usually they tend to work with people they know already or they've got a relationship with, and that's the first question: who do we know when it comes to thinking about sponsoring a new entity? There are some very good programs, and in fact initiatives that are trying to deepen that relationship between businesses and the arts. So the Museums Association's Transformers is one of them. Although I've actually been in contact with them, and the slight issue I find with that program is the fact that there is one of their requirements is having a number of years experience in the arts world. Which obviously is, in my opinion, is a restriction instead of being opening an opportunity to share more information. And then arts and business, again, a really good proposition, but unfortunately it's restricted to London and Birmingham for the time being. So it seems like what is needed is a proper cultural shift in the sector and across the board. And then I'm planning to cover a case study for Tate. I think this is a mainly successful example of innovation and entrepreneurship for a number of reasons. So first of all, they've embraced what is essentially the concept of the modern museum. So they've gone through a rebrand because they've understood how important it is to essentially communicate what your brand stands for, because that's what companies are also buying into when they decide to sponsor any exhibition. And also they offer a full entertainment experience. It's not just a question of going to a museum, but you can meet friends and enjoy your time there. And then I've got a few examples here of good innovation. So the UBS Rehang, this is a project that is being criticized because essentially it was sponsoring part of the Tate collection, but also included a bespoke element whereby some of the collection by UBS was on display, which caused a bit of friction. Uniqlo, it's a great example of how Tate are really trying to maximize all of their streams, in the sense that I don't know of any art organization in the UK that is maximizing their lates, but they're doing that. And also there is a bespoke element to this campaign, in the sense that it's very much aligned with their marketing campaign, as well as being an association just with the museum itself. Obviously we're all familiar with the Unilever series, successful in many ways because we don't really have a lot of FMCG clients sponsoring the arts. So in that respect, that is a long-standing association with the arts, and it's very successful. And then BMW, I think it's really quite remarkable, because essentially it's all about building content that extends what BMW are good at. That it's all about technology and bigging up that they're not just a car manufacturer, but what they're doing just goes beyond, obviously, technology and design. Finally, I just wanted to have briefly look at this. So despite all this, I don't know why it's not showing. Well, I'll tell you, there's something missing on this slide for some reason. But essentially what I wanted to say here is the fact that despite all of these successes, Tate is still operating at a deficit of roughly £2 million per year. I know, because I've been looking at their accounts, and essentially every year they've been using their reserves in order to get rid of that deficit. So that's obviously that's not an optimal way of running a business. And then finally, I just wanted to share with you what my concerns are. Essentially, I'm finding it really difficult to fully back up what the arguments I'm trying to make, because the literature existing on a comparison between the arts and the media sector is pretty much non-existing. So all the reflections are essentially based on my own personal experiences so far and discussions with people in the industry. There's also really limited academic resources on art sponsorship. I've only been able to find one book that was published in 1997. So some of the details are a little bit dated, although still valid. And this is actually one of the main sticking points, information sharing. That's been very, very challenging, because I've spoken to or tried to contact 10 museums, and none of them are interested in talking to me, because there seems to be a lot of but I'm happy that I will be talking to Arts and Business, for example, the Independent Museums Association, so all the bodies that are interested in instigating that change. And finally, what's concerning is the fact that obviously because of all these reasons, I think it will be tricky to actually gather different viewpoints that will enable me to come to a conclusion that it's credible. And that's basically me.
One point that might be interesting to you possibly to look at is the Uniqlo also has a partnership with MoMA, and they sell t-shirts on their website based on the exhibitions that are happening, so they're limited edition. So for instance, I have a Keith Haring t-shirt from when they had the exhibition there. So and I don't know if that was a sponsorship, but certainly it helps with the Uniqlo marketing, and I would think for MoMA as well.
Well, obviously the market in the US is way more developed, and then obviously the UK is the one that follows. Yeah, that's a lot more common in the US.
So can I just jump in here, because following from that, because I thought, I think focusing on one case study doesn't mean that I think making comparisons within those will help you to draw more substantial conclusions, right? And I thought that was actually a really good example because maybe you could find out how much Uniqlo is paying MoMA compared to what they're paying Tate, where then you could argue that a more, cohesive partnership would benefit Tate, and maybe that if you're thinking about what is the value of something, so I think I think you need to look a little bit outward from Tate in order to come to conclusions, right? Because if you only look at one case studies without comparing, if you don't have the academic literature, I think that might become then difficult. So I thought that was a good point.
The other thing that came to mind, which goes along those same lines, is Unilever in the arts and business literature that I've been studying, they have integrated arts into what they call a catalyst program for marketing, for internal communications. Like they have creative writing courses, and they work with local schools to write children's books. So embedding sponsorship into the culture of the organization might be another thing to look at. And they're not relying on museums, but perhaps they could.
No, absolutely.
What I'm missing, Luciana, you write, so we're going to explore how and if business tactics and practices utilized within the commercial media sector can be further explored. Maybe I missed it, but you don't really say what these practices are, how you, because if you want to see how they can be applied, you need to describe them, I guess.
Yes, I mean, obviously in 15 minutes I had very limited time to actually draw analogies. But you know, it's I try to introduce that. So, for example, anything to do with I was explaining about the limited network, for example. That's for one. So you always find the usual, what I call the usual suspects. So you know, it's always the same types of companies or the same contacts. They're always getting contact with that particular museum, and instead of talking to the market, you're just still talking to a couple of. For example,
identify practices.
Yes, so one of them is
sector, but you don't want to.
So that is one of them. So in the media industry, what happens is obviously in television, what you would do is you would talk to the market, and what I mean by that is you talk to the big media agencies, so who control the media spend for all these big clients. So in one communication, you can basically address everyone, and then if there is a suitable brief, then they get in contact, and you can start that conversation. But at the same time, you can still have your contacts with clients direct, for example. So that's just one aspect.
So maybe what I'm saying is, what I'm missing is sort of analysis. Why is it so successful in the commercial media sector, and why isn't it in the museum sector? And what are sort of the gaps we want to bridge? I think you addressed a few, but it wasn't clear, at least. I mean, that's where it would start, because it's 3.5 billion versus 100 million or something. So why is there such a big gap?
There's the efficiencies in the ad agency model that haven't been replicated in the sponsorship model.
So one is communication. So you've got a very, very small number of people communicating, and a lot of companies. And I mean, a lot of them wouldn't even be aware what they can do in a museum, for example, because they've got their media agency that is controlling all that and gives them recommendations as to what they should be doing with their with their budgets. So that's one big problem, right there.
Yeah. No, I think I would like. Well,
I know.
If you build that into your research, I think it will be much more stronger.
Yes,
sort of storyline towards whatever you want to prove. Because you were saying I was sort of struggling with whatever I try to prove.
I wonder if you might fine-tune the research question from what can the whatever it is art sector learn from the media sector to maybe something like to what extent can strategies and tactics employed in the media industry apply to the cultural sector? Because I think where it's interesting is some of what we were talking about last night in terms of how the sector is different, and there's a sort of different ethical framework. So things like, I remember way back we had an interesting discussion about product placement and how that's totally acceptable practice in TV and film. But if Louis Vuitton is sponsoring an exhibition and they want to put, you just mentioned an example of UBS. Putting their paintings in. There's a different kind of ethical standard there that I think. So I think maybe outlining some of what those tactics are, and not only looking at which ones apply, but why they don't. So it's sort of more of a kind of comparison or analysis. Maybe.
Well, a lot of it is to do with. The meaning of culture, the value of culture. All of a sudden, it's okay to. Philip Morris is a classic example. So they've been sponsoring the arts for a number of years, and then that became an issue, but now they're all over sport, and now sport reaches way more people than art does, and no one has got a problem with that.
Yeah.
Or very few do. Shell is another example, and BP.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very good, well structured. I was going to make the same comment about you need to redefine your research, the question. You've presented the kind of historical overview in the very kind of detailed, abstract, set out, what has happened to date. What I wanted to focus on is the whole kind of issue of the lack of, knowledge exchange, which gets in the way of the arts and cultural sector, not just harnessing and being able to capitalize more on what's happened commercially, but it is kind of part of what. It's the culture of the sector, and it's what needs to change. There needs to be a significant mindset shift, because knowledge exchange is not something that they understand. The networks are still too closed. There's also a strategic reason, for example, why they don't disclose necessarily how much they fund. Even if you look in their annual report, it's never the accurate figure that they will disclose. Sometimes companies get a huge amount for what they give to the arts organisation.
Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes because of their other funders, they don't want to be precise about what they're getting from elsewhere. So it's really quite complex why they're not. But you can imagine a scenario if they are giving, we are giving more than the investment is actually worth. And if it's not kind of open and being debated, we'll never know what the true value is. And I think
Absolutely.
a lot is kind of being given away. But if you get the same company that goes to sports, they will never get away with it in a sports environment, because there's a kind of very different mindset and people who are sitting down with those corporations and making the deal. And so it goes back to, what's just been said, what Charlotte just said in the conversations last night, is what do we in the sector need to do in terms of changing the language and our vocabulary, and to operate in a very different kind of business domain. And I'm not meaning it in any kind of crude way of applying just kind of business strategy in the arts sector, but we need to recognize the wider impact when we don't knowledge exchange, when we don't build networks broader than our own people we know and we are comfortable with. So I think there is a big part of that, and you alluded to, the Museums Association Transformers program, which they say is for people who work in the industry who have so many years experience. Think what would happen if you were open up to bringing in people who bring in a different kind of talent that you don't have. If you're only prepared to invest and develop people who are in your sector all the time, you're not going to get the innovation and the kind of mixed economy if you need. So those kind of practices is really what needs to change. One of the things that I've noticed in, being on the Fashion EMBA, it's attracting not just fashion designers, but people coming from a kind of corporate world of bringing a different kind of expertise into the fashion industry. And these are people coming from, the financial sector, corporate lawyers. Why? So how do we become much more strategic in forming those kind of lines and seeing that kind of mix in a program like this as well?
Can I just, but Maureen, do you have any sort of more reading or ideas? Because I think what I've been, Luciana and I have also been discussing, because what I think within the parameter of a dissertation, of course, it's important you reflect and analyze what has happened, right? And I think sort of to say what is needed is maybe in the overall, body of the work will be a nice little conclusion that looks into the future. But I think sort of the problem is like, okay, so do you know of any reports or anything else that has maybe been published as part of, the Museums Association that helps Luciana with more sort of meat to make these arguments that I'm sure we all agree with?
I've actually found a report on a research that was commissioned by the European Commission. I can't remember the name of it now because it's I haven't looked at it in a while, but there are some interesting reflections in there. But that was part of a very, very small pilot project that obviously ended, and now obviously and it's quite expensive to get them going. So obviously that's one limitation. So I can use some of those details to back up what I was also trying to say, because I've spoken to the Museums Association, and they were asking, they were very fiscal and saying, how many years have you been working in the arts? And
there must be stuff around, is there enough competition created between these museums, or to get, I think the negotiation stance you take makes it very difficult maybe to actually get any, but if you say I only want your money and you get nothing back, because that's, we are curators and we don't want interference, then you have no negotiation position almost. So all these sort of difference with the media sector I think are interesting to explore.
I think you should revisit Hesmanthal. Have you read David Hesmanthal? I mean, even just things like sort of looking at the film industry and financing, and you might, and it's fairly comprehensive, and it's just sort of to begin to tease out how that translates to the cultural sector.
You're not
and he's
going
written other articles
get
beyond
the innovation
that.
and the kind of mix. Economy.
I'm actually looking at that again.
Kind of practices. It's really what needs to change. One of the things that I've noticed is being on the Fashion EMBA.
Yes, that's the difficulty. A lot of materials being written in the 90s.
People coming from a kind of corporate world of bringing a different kind of expertise into the fashion industry, and these are people coming from financial sector. Why?
Background and
so how do we become much more strategic in forming those kind of minds and see that kind of mix and culture and why
is not so
Can I
receptive,
just,
or
but Marie, do you have any
how was
sort of
sponsorship in the 18th century? What was sponsorship then? And then the evolution of commercial sponsorship in parallel, and sort of trying to understand maybe what's different and why it has evolved in the way that it has evolved. It's kind of
it's quite. I'm looking at all that, and interestingly, there's been quite a lot of research into, for example, what the audiences think about sponsorship. And actually they do have a positive attitude towards sponsorship, because they think it really is contributing towards the production of a cultural product. It's just that it's everyone else that needs to basically join up and change that mindset, because it's not true that it's seen as a negative.
But I think the resistance is more from within.
Yes, completely.
Mindset, and this is what I was sort of trying to see. Okay, well, the arts have actually always been sponsored in one way or another, but in the mind of the artist or the arts community, that sponsorship hasn't come in such a direct way.
No.
And so is that kind of, to me, is where the kind of cultural clash is.
It also seems like almost a translation of terms. What
Precisely.
they're used to calling it versus what a corporate sector is used to calling it.
And the competition, which is really fierce. So obviously it's not that museums have got it easy. They've got a huge opportunity for growth, but at the same time they're competing with television, online, on you know, experiential events, everything. So it's difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think we have to move on.